I'm Maren, I'm 27. 3 years ago my mother stood in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, and gave me 1 hour to pack a bag, looking me dead in the eye as she said it. I can keep this family, or I can keep you, Maren. I can't do both anymore. I chose, in that hour, to believe her. I packed what fit in 2 suitcases, and left the house my father built our whole life around, and for 3 years, neither of us said a single word to the other. 3 weeks ago, she texted me asking to get coffee. I want to tell you what that coffee meeting actually turned out to be about, because it had almost nothing to do with missing me. It had to do with a house that, as it turns out, legally stopped being hers 2 years ago without her ever quite getting around to mentioning it. It had to do with a filing error nobody bothered to fix once they realized it worked in their favor. And it had to do with a stepfather who may have known exactly what he was doing when that error first happened. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the people who get chosen last are usually the ones who end up holding the deed. If you've ever been given an ultimatum by someone who was supposed to choose you automatically, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. My life now, 3 years out from that hour in the kitchen, looks almost nothing like the life I thought I'd have back then. I live in a small rental apartment 2 towns over, work as a project coordinator for a construction firm, and have built slowly and deliberately the kind of quiet, self-sufficient stability that comes from having no other choice but to figure it out entirely on your own. I have a partner now, Owen, steady and patient in a way I didn't fully know I needed until I had it, and a small handful of close friends who became, over those 3 years, something close to the family I'd lost. I don't say any of that for sympathy. I say it because I want you to understand, going into what happened 3 weeks ago, that I wasn't a woman still standing frozen in that kitchen, waiting for a phone call. I'd genuinely moved on. Or at least, I'd built a very convincing version of moving on. Owen and I met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner about a year after I left that house, back when I was still sleeping on a friend's pull-out couch and barely able to afford the bus fare to get to that dinner in the first place. He never once made me feel like the version of myself he met that year was somehow less than the version I might have been if my family had stayed intact. I think that's part of why I fell for him as hard and as quickly as I did. He was the first person in a long time who seemed to see me clearly rather than as a problem someone else needed to solve. My friends from that period, especially Bree, became something closer to chosen family than I ever expected friendships to be able to hold, showing up for the unglamorous parts of rebuilding a life from nothing, in a way my actual family, in the end, never once had. My mother's text arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. No warning, no lead-up. Hi, sweetheart. I know it's been a long time. I'd love to see you if you're open to it. Coffee, whenever works for you. I miss you. I sat with my phone for nearly 20 minutes before showing it to Owen, who read it twice and asked, gently, what I wanted to do. I told him I honestly didn't know. 3 years of silence had calcified into something I'd stopped actively grieving, and the sudden reappearance of that particular number on my screen felt less like an opening, and more like an old wound being pressed on without warning. I typed out 3 different responses before sending any of them, deleting each one for sounding either too eager or too cold, neither of which felt honest to what I see. Actually felt reading her message. Owen didn't push me toward a decision either way, just sat with me on the couch while I turned it over out loud, occasionally offering a quiet, whatever you choose, I'm right here, which turned out to be exactly the kind of support I needed most in that moment. Not advice, just steady company while I found my own way to an answer. I finally sent back 4 words, sure, when works for you, and immediately felt my stomach drop the second I hit send, wondering if I'd just made a mistake I wouldn't be able to take back. I agreed to meet her, mostly because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still wanted to believe a mother reaching out after 3 years might genuinely just mean she missed her daughter. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our 2 lives, and she looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 3 years themselves, and everything to do with something more recent sitting on her shoulders. The conversation started warmly enough, careful catch-up questions about my job, about Owen, about whether I was doing all right. But it kept circling back, in small, oddly specific ways, toward the house, whether I'd kept any of my father's old paperwork, whether I remembered him ever mentioning how the house was supposed to work after he was gone. I left that coffee shop with a headache and a feeling I couldn't quite name yet, somewhere between hope and suspicion. She hugged me at the start, tentative and stiff, the hug of someone who wasn't sure her arms were still welcome around me, and I remember standing there for a second, not quite knowing how to hug her back, my body apparently still working through 3 years of instinct before my arms finally, awkwardly, returned the gesture. She looked good in the ordinary sense, hair done, a nice sweater, but there was something underneath it, a kind of brittleness I hadn't seen in her before, like she was holding herself together more carefully than usual for an occasion she'd clearly been dreading as much as anticipating. When she asked about my father's paperwork the third time, phrasing it slightly differently each time as though hoping a new angle might get her a more useful answer, I finally just told her I honestly didn't remember much about it, watching her face do something complicated before she smoothly changed the subject back to asking about Owen's job. To understand any of what came next, you need to see the hour that started all of this, 3 years earlier, exactly as it happened. My mother had remarried 2 years after my father died, a man named Curtis, confident and a little too smooth in the specific way some people are smooth right up until you're the one standing in their path. The house should be run. Opinions that increasingly didn't include much room for a 20-something stepdaughter who still lived there, while finishing her degree, in a house that had technically belonged to my father, not to him. I want to be fair to my mother here because I don't think she married Curtis blindly or foolishly. My father's death had left her genuinely lonely in a way I only partially understood at the time, still deep in my own grief, and too young to fully register the different shape hers took. Curtis, when he first arrived in our lives, was attentive to her in a way that clearly filled something real for her, and for the first year or so, I even tried, in my own limited way, to give him a fair chance. It was only gradually, as his comments about updating things around here turned from casual to pointed, that I started to understand exactly how much of the house's future he'd already begun quietly planning around. Well before that final argument ever happened, the fight that ended everything started over something almost embarrassingly small. Curtis wanting to convert my father's old study into a home office for his consulting business, and me, protective of one of the last untouched rooms in the house, pushing back harder than I probably needed to. It escalated fast, the way arguments do when they're actually about something much bigger than the room itself. By the end of it, my mother was standing between us in the kitchen, and Curtis said, flatly, that it was time for her to decide once and for all whether this was going to be his house or a shrine to a dead man's daughter. My mother looked at me and said the sentence I've turned over in my head every day for the last 3 years. I can keep this family or I can keep you, Maren. I can't do both anymore. I had 1 hour. The strangest part of that whole scene, looking back now, is how quiet the room actually was in the moments right after she said it. I remember expecting to cry immediately, or to scream, or to do something the moment clearly seemed to be demanding of me, and instead I just stood there, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. The specific stillness that shows up right before your body understands something your mind hasn't fully caught up to yet. Curtis didn't say anything else. He just watched, arms still crossed, with an expression I spent 3 years trying and failing, not to remember clearly, not triumph exactly, but something close to it, the look of a man who'd finally gotten the outcome he'd been quietly working toward for longer than either my mother or I understood at the time. I packed in a fog I still can't fully describe, grabbing clothes, a few photographs, my father's old watch off my dresser, leaving behind an entire childhood's worth of things I simply didn't have room or time to save. Remember standing in the doorway of my own bedroom for exactly 1 full minute before I made myself walk out, understanding, even in the middle of that shock, that whatever I left behind in that hour, I probably wasn't ever getting back. My mother didn't say goodbye at the door. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, and Curtis stood beside her, and I walked out to my car with 2 suitcases and absolutely nowhere solid to go. I sat in my car in the driveway for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself actually put the key in the ignition, staring back at the house through the windshield, half expecting the front door to open, half expecting someone, anyone, to come running out and tell me this had all been some terrible overreaction that could still be walked back. Nobody came out. The porch light clicked off automatically at some point while I sat there, an ordinary mechanical thing that somehow felt like the cruelest detail of the entire hour. The house itself simply continuing its evening routine, indifferent to the fact that I no longer had a key that worked in its door. I drove to a gas station 2 miles away and sat in the parking lot for another hour after that, calling exactly one person, a college friend named Priya, who didn't ask a single unnecessary question before telling me her couch was already made up. The first few months after that were the hardest of my entire life. A friend's couch, then a shared studio apartment I could barely afford on a part-time job, finishing my degree with a kind of grim, joyless determination, because I understood, clearly for the first time, that nobody was coming to rescue me if I let anything slip. I didn't call my mother, she didn't call me. 3 years is a long time to build a wall that thick, and by the end of the first year, I'd mostly stopped waiting for it to come down on its own. I remember the specific texture of that first winter most clearly, working closing shifts at a coffee shop most nights, studying for exams at a corner table after everyone else had gone home, walking back to Priya's apartment in the cold because I couldn't yet afford my own car repairs after mine finally gave out. Priya never once made me feel like a burden, though I know looking back how much of a burden I probably was during those months, financially and emotionally both. She'd leave notes on the fridge some mornings, small, silly things, just to make me laugh before a hard day, and I think honestly, that kind of quiet, undemanding kindness did more to keep me steady that year than anything else could have. By spring, I'd found the studio apartment, small and drafty, but entirely mine, and standing in it for the first time with my 2 suitcases, finally fully unpacked, I remember feeling something that wasn't quite happiness yet, but was at least the shape happiness might eventually grow into. The night after that coffee meeting, unable to sleep, I finally pulled an old fireproof box out of my closet. My father's paperwork, things I'd salvaged in the chaos of that first year and never fully gone through since too painful to sort at the time. Near the bottom, I found my own copy of a legal document I barely remembered signing acknowledgement of as a grieving 20-year-old. A trust instrument my father had set up before he died, naming my mother as trustee of the family home with a right to live there, but specifying in plain legal language I'd apparently skimmed past years earlier without fully absorbing, that full ownership of the house would transfer outright to me the moment I turned 25. I sat on my apartment floor for a long time with that document in my lap, other pieces of the box scattered around me, my father's old watch, a stack of photographs from before Curtis, a birthday card in his handwriting I hadn't let myself reread in years. I remembered, faintly, sitting in an attorney's office at 20, numb with grief, signing a stack of papers my mother had told me were just formalities, nodding along without really absorbing a word of what any of it actually said. I understood, sitting there 3 years later, that some younger, less guarded version of myself had actually been handed the exact information I needed all along and simply hadn't been in any state to recognize its weight at the time. I sat on my apartment floor, doing the math twice, just to be sure. I'd turned 25 2 years ago, roughly a year into the silence between my mother and me. If that clause had actually been executed the way it was written, ownership of that house should have transferred to me, in full, 2 years before that Tuesday night coffee meeting ever happened. I thought about my mother's odd, circling questions about how the house was supposed to work and felt a very specific, cold kind of clarity settle over the entire conversation, one piece at a time. I called a friend from college, Bree, now a paralegal at a real estate firm, the next morning, and asked her, carefully, whether she could help me understand what I was looking at. She reviewed the trust language over video call and confirmed my read of it within minutes. "This is pretty clean actually," she said. "If this transfer was never formally recorded with the county, that doesn't mean it didn't happen legally. The trust terms themselves are what control ownership, not just the paperwork catching up to it. You may already be the legal owner of that house and just not know it yet." I sat with that sentence a long time, feeling the shape of the last 3 years quietly rearrange itself around a fact nobody in that house had apparently ever told me. Bree, careful and methodical the way she'd always been even back in our college study group days, walked me through the actual language line by line, translating the denser legal phrasing into something I could actually hold on to. "See this part here," she said, highlighting a clause on her screen. "This isn't conditional language. It doesn't say the transfer happens once someone files the paperwork. It says the interest vests automatically at 25. The recording is basically just supposed to be an administrative formality, confirming something that's already legally true." I asked her, half hoping she'd tell me I was misunderstanding it, whether that meant what I thought it meant. She looked at me steadily through the screen, and said, "I think it means you should probably talk to an actual real estate attorney this week, not just your paralegal friend on a Tuesday night video call." Bree helped me pull the actual county property records that same week, and what we found deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The deed still listed my mother as sole owner, with no record of the trust's termination or transfer ever being filed. More concerning, a home equity line of credit had been recorded against the property just 8 months earlier for a substantial amount, with my mother and Curtis both listed as borrowers, a loan taken out against a house that, according to my father's own trust language, hadn't actually been legally hers to borrow against for the past 2 years. Bree pulled up the lender's public filing details alongside the loan amount, and the two of us sat there a while just staring at the number together. A little over $90,000 drawn against equity in a house neither my mother nor Curtis, strictly speaking, had full legal authority to leverage that way. "This is the part that actually worries me for them," Bree said, more serious now than she'd been the whole conversation. "If a lender ever runs a proper title search and finds this discrepancy, that loan could become a real mess for everyone involved, including whoever signed off on approving it without catching the issue first." I remember hearing that, less satisfaction than a strange, unwanted flicker of concern for my mother, tangled up together with everything else I was still trying to process. I understood, looking at that HELOC filing date, exactly why that coffee invitation had finally arrived after 3 years of total silence. It hadn't been missing me that finally broke through. It had been money, a loan taken against a house they may have already suspected, or at least worried, they didn't have clear legal standing to have borrowed against in the first place. With my mother now needing something from me she hadn't needed in 3 years. My continued silence, or my cooperation, or both. I consulted a real estate attorney the following week, a careful, thorough man named Elias Warfield, who reviewed the trust, the property records, and the HELOC filing together. He was quiet for a long moment after finishing, then said the sentence that changed how I understood my own position in all of this. "Based on the trust's plain language, you very likely became the outright legal owner of that property 2 years ago, whether or not anyone recorded it. That means the HELOC your mother and stepfather took out 8 months ago was potentially taken against a property they no longer had clear legal authority to encumber. This is significant, Maren, and it's very much in your favor. I'd spent 3 years believing I'd lost that house entirely, along with everything else that hour had cost me. For the first time, I understood I might legally still hold the one thing that family had never expected me to be able to reclaim. Elias asked me, near the end of that first meeting, why I'd waited until now to look into any of it, and I found myself explaining, more honestly than I'd planned to with a stranger, that I'd simply never let myself imagine there was anything left in that house worth going back for. "That's fairly common, actually," he said, not unkindly. "People who've been pushed out of a family often stop looking for what might still belong to them, because looking feels like hoping, and hoping after something like that can feel more dangerous than just accepting the loss. I told him that sounded uncomfortably accurate. He said, gathering his notes together, that in his experience it usually took an outside event, something that forced the question back into view, before people in my position ever came looking at all. I thought about that coffee invitation the whole drive home. Elias laid out my options carefully. I could quietly let the past stay the past, decline to pursue the ownership question at all, and simply move on with my life exactly as I had been. I could reach out to my mother directly, give her a chance to explain and correct the situation honestly before anything became formal. Or I could have Elias send a formal notice asserting my ownership interest, which would force the issue into the open immediately, whatever the fallout with my mother turned out to be. I thought about that hour in the kitchen, my mother's flat, final voice, Curtis standing beside her with his arms crossed. I thought about the coffee meeting, 3 years of silence broken not out of love but apparently out of financial necessity. I understood, sitting in Elias's office, that I couldn't unknow what I now knew, and that quietly walking away from it would mean, in its own way, choosing silence one more time, exactly the way silence had defined the last 3 years already. I talked it through with Owen for most of a weekend, walking laps around our neighborhood park, because sitting still with it felt impossible. Didn't tell me what to do, which I was grateful for, but he did ask me one question that stuck with me the rest of that weekend. If this whole thing had happened to a friend of yours instead of you, what would you tell her to do? I didn't have to think very long about the answer. I'd have told her, without hesitation, that she deserved to know the full truth about something that legally belonged to her, and that protecting someone else's comfort at the expense of her own clarity had never actually been her responsibility in the first place. Hearing myself think through the advice I'd give a friend made the decision, once I finally let myself apply it to my own situation, feel considerably less complicated than it had felt all weekend. I chose to send the formal notice and Elias filed it within the week, a letter asserting my ownership interest under the trust terms, requesting immediate confirmation of the property's legal status before any further encumbrance or transaction occurred. I didn't call my mother first. I let the letter speak, the same flat, unavoidable way her own sentence in that kitchen had once spoken for both of us. She called me 4 days later, her voice tight with a fear I'd never once heard directed at me before. "Maren, what is this? A lawyer's letter about the house? I don't understand." I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I'd found Dad's trust, understood what it actually said, and was simply asking for confirmation of who legally owned the house today. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I understood, even before she spoke again, that she'd known more about this than her confusion was letting on. "I need to think," she finally said, and hung up before I could respond, which struck me, in the moment, as an oddly familiar echo of my own instinct 3 years earlier, standing in that same kitchen with an hour to make sense of something too large to process all at once. I sat with my phone in my hand afterward, feeling an unexpected flicker of something like sympathy, quickly followed by frustration at myself for feeling it at all. 3 years of silence had taught me to expect very little from her, and yet some old stubborn part of me apparently still wanted to give her room to surprise me, even now, even after everything. The full picture came out over the following weeks, piece by piece, through Elias's formal requests for records. An email surfaced, sent by Curtis to my father's original estate attorney's office, roughly 2 months before that hour in the kitchen, asking pointed, oddly specific questions about what happens practically if the transfer paperwork on a trust like this gets delayed or never gets filed. The timing landed hard, sitting there in Elias's conference room reading it for the first time. Curtis hadn't just failed to notice the transfer never happened. He'd been asking about exactly that possibility months before it ever became relevant. Elias walked me through the email's full context carefully, cautious about overstating what it actually proved. "On its own, this shows curiosity, maybe even foresight," he said. "It doesn't prove he caused the delay. What it does prove is that he understood, well before the ultimatum, exactly what was legally at stake in that house, and exactly what would happen to his position in it if that transfer went through on schedule. That context matters, even if it isn't, by itself, a smoking gun." I read the email 3 more times after our meeting, turning over the specific phrasing Curtis had used. Practically speaking, a phrase that felt, the more I sat with it, less like idle curiosity, and more like a man quietly calculating his own leverage, well before anyone else in the house understood there was leverage to calculate. Elias's further digging turned up something that made the pattern even harder to explain away as coincidence. The paralegal at my father's original attorney's office who'd mishandled the trust's recording, letting the 25th birthday transfer slip through without ever being filed, had also done unrelated administrative work around that same period for a small business consulting client, a client whose name, cross-referenced against public filings, traced back to one of Curtis's own business associates. It wasn't definitive proof of direct interference. It was, Elias said carefully, enough of a connection that innocent clerical error stops being the most obvious explanation. I called my mother directly after learning that, needing one real conversation before this went any further. She was quiet for a long time on the phone, then said something I hadn't expected. I found out the transfer was never recorded almost a year ago, going through old files for something unrelated. I didn't tell you. I told myself it was an old mistake not worth reopening after everything. But honestly, Maren, some part of me was relieved. I've lost you already. I didn't want to lose the house too on top of it. I asked her gently whether she suspected Curtis had known or done something to cause the delay in the first place. She was quiet a long moment before answering. I've wondered. I've been too afraid to actually ask him directly, because I think some part of me already suspects what the answer would be. I told myself, that whole year I stayed quiet about it, that I was protecting our marriage, she continued, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. But sitting here talking to you right now, I think I was really just protecting myself from finding out something about him, and about myself, that I wasn't ready to face. I've been so afraid of losing another version of this family, that I let myself become exactly the kind of person who lets silence do the deciding, the same as I did to you 3 years ago. I don't think I understood, until this exact conversation, how much those two silences actually looked alike. I didn't have a comforting response ready for her. I just told her I appreciated her finally saying it plainly, and that plainly was going to have to be enough for both of us, starting now. With the email and the paralegal connection both documented, Elias formalized my ownership claim fully, sending notice to the lender who'd issued the HELOC, informing them the loan had been secured against a property my mother and Curtis no longer had clear legal authority to encumber. It was a serious step, and I understood, authorizing it, that there was no soft version of what came next for that household. Whatever fragile financial footing the HELOC had been meant to provide them was about to become considerably more complicated, permanently. A way 3 years of silence had never quite managed to be. Curtis called me directly once the lender notice landed, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it, dropping the careful charm I remembered from years of strained family dinners. "You're really going to do this, Maren? After everything your mother's done for you? This is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction that got you asked to leave in the first place." I told him evenly that I hadn't been asked to leave. I'd been given 1 hour and a sentence about choosing a family over a daughter, and that whatever drama he thought I was creating now was considerably smaller than what he and my mother had created for me 3 years earlier, in that same kitchen, without ever once asking my opinion on the matter. He tried a different angle after that, softer, almost reasonable sounding, the specific tone I remembered from years of watching him talk his way around my mother's occasional doubts. "Look, whatever happened with the paperwork, that's ancient history at this point. We can figure out something fair between us, family to family, without lawyers making this uglier than it needs to be." I told him that family to family had stopped being an option the exact hour I'd been given 60 minutes to pack 2 suitcases, and that I had no particular interest in negotiating informally with someone who'd apparently been asking estate attorneys hypothetical questions about my inheritance months before he ever helped push me out the door. He didn't have a response ready for that. It was, as far as I know, the last time he ever tried calling me directly again. The mediation session, once Elias arranged it, happened in his conference room on a gray afternoon, my mother pale and unsteady, Curtis controlled but visibly rattled beneath the surface. My mother finally said, out loud, in front of both of us, what she'd only admitted to me quietly, on the phone. "I found out the transfer never happened almost a year ago. I should have told you the moment I found out. I let myself believe silence was kinder than reopening a wound, when really it was just easier for me." Curtis, cornered by the email evidence Elias laid out plainly on the table, finally admitted he'd looked into the situation, after learning, from Maren's 24th birthday conversation months before the ultimatum, exactly when the transfer clause would trigger, though he stopped short of directly admitting he'd caused the filing error himself, calling it instead an unfortunate oversight I probably should have flagged sooner. The practical resolution, once the legal questions settled, wasn't the clean, satisfying eviction some part of me might have imagined during angrier moments over those 3 weeks. I chose instead, with Elias's help, a structured arrangement. My mother could remain in the house for a defined transition period under a proper lease agreement, paying fair rent directly to me as legal owner, with Curtis's name removed entirely from any future claim or authority over the property. It wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth, finally, formally recognized and put into terms that couldn't be quietly ignored or rewritten again. I didn't pursue further legal action against Curtis regarding the paralegal connection, though Elias confirmed I had standing to dig further if I chose to. What I wanted most, sitting in that mediation room, wasn't to destroy the life my mother had built with him. It was simply for the truth about that house, and about that hour in the kitchen, to exist somewhere permanent and undeniable, in a place neither of them could ever quietly manage away from me again. Rebuilding anything resembling a relationship with my mother after that mediation took real time, most of that fall spent in careful, occasional phone calls. Neither of us rushed toward forgiveness. I told her plainly in one of those calls that reclaiming the house wasn't about punishing her specifically, it was about refusing to let silence be the only language our family knew how to use with each other, the same silence that had let a filing error sit unaddressed for a year, rather than risk an uncomfortable conversation. She didn't have a clean response to that. I don't think one exists. I think often about that hour in the kitchen, my 2 suitcases, my father's watch, the only thing from that house I managed to grab in the panic. I understand now that my mother's sentence that day, "I can keep this family, or I can keep you," was never actually a real choice, not the way she framed it. A family that requires choosing against your own child isn't a family being protected. It's just a smaller, more fragile version of one, propped up by exactly the kind of silence that eventually let a house slip out of everyone's hands except the daughter it was always legally meant for. It's been 3 months since the mediation. My mother lives in the house still, under our new lease arrangement, and we talk most weeks now, careful, slow, honest, in a way we genuinely never managed during all those years before the ultimatum. Curtis moved out shortly after the mediation, the marriage apparently unable to survive the weight of everything that surfaced once the silence finally broke. I don't know exactly what I feel about that. Relief, mostly, and something quieter underneath it that isn't quite triumph. Last weekend, I drove out to the house for the first time in over 3 years, at my mother's invitation, and stood in the doorway of what used to be my old bedroom, now converted into a guest room with none of my old things left in it. It didn't feel like loss the way I expected it to. It felt, oddly, like walking into a house that was finally, legally, undeniably mine on my own terms, exactly the way my father had quietly planned for it to be, all along, long before anyone else in that kitchen ever got the chance to decide otherwise. My mother made tea that afternoon, the same chipped mug set I remembered from childhood, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd once told me she could keep this family, or keep me, and talked for almost 2 hours about nothing particularly dramatic at all. Owen's job, her new part-time volunteer work at the library, whether I still remembered how to make my father's terrible over-salted spaghetti sauce from memory. It wasn't a movie ending. There was no single moment where either of us cried and declared everything forgiven. It was just 2 people, slowly, carefully, relearning how to sit across a table from each other, without an hourglass running out somewhere in the background. That's my story. 1 hour, 1 filing error nobody wanted to admit to, and a house that finally belongs to the daughter it was always meant for. If this reminded you that being given an ultimatum doesn't mean you actually lost the argument, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever been asked to choose themselves last. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.